Hi everyone, and welcome. We are so excited to have you all here tonight. Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Anderson, and I'm the president of Brooklyn College, and thrilled to have the next iteration of the Presidential Lecture Series. Tonight we have a special treat. We have Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, with us. And it's such an honor to have her here. She's also the head of the Sustainable Development Group, the UN Sustainable Development Group. She's chair of that at the United Nations, and she is finally here with us tonight, so we're excited. Prior to her appointment, I'll just tell you a little bit about her. Prior to her appointment at the UN, she served as Minister of Environment of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, where she steered the country's efforts on climate action and the protection of the natural environment. She first joined the UN in 2012, where she was assigned to be Special Assistant to then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. She led the process that resulted in the global agreement on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals, a huge advance that she spearheaded. Ms. Mohammed began her career working on the design of schools and clinics in Nigeria. She focused on increasing access to education and other social services before moving into the public sector, where she rose to a position of being the advisor to 4 presidents successively in Nigeria. She consulted them on poverty, public sector reform, and sustainable development. She has dedicated her career to advancing the global agenda for social justice and for sustainable development, and we're honored to have her here tonight. Please welcome Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. That wasn't me, by the way. I said all those nice things that you said, wasn't me. But good evening, and thank you so much, President Anderson, for the kind introduction and the invitation to this presidential lecture series. It's been a really busy day, and I'm sorry I got you waiting. I've never seen so many traffic lights in my life, but coming out of the UN today, one of the preoccupations that we had was the ousting of the Prime Minister of Haiti. And since I've been in the UN, the one focus that we've had is how do we get peace to Haiti and the people who, through one calamity and tragedy after another, it still eludes us. And that's why today is a valuable opportunity to discuss the relevance of the UN and the multilateral system in today's divided and really challenging world. And many will ask the question, what is the use? Well, for me today, discussing this, especially with young people who will inherit our world, and yes, also the mistakes that my generation has made. Brooklyn College has always been a global village, and it's been uniting students and faculty from around the world. And it includes a number of immigrant and first-generation college students. You understand the importance of building bridges across cultures, looking beyond differences, and showing us all that diversity is an incredible richness that benefits us all. And seeing that richness, seeing that wealth and not the weakness is one of the challenges that we have today. And I know that many of you carry this spirit with you wherever you go. That same spirit breathes life into the United Nations and our global mission. If we live in a global village, as we have all said of recent, then the United Nations is our global town hall. It's always what I've believed, is that this is the one place that we can all have visibility of everyone. Our voices are all equal in the UN, but not necessarily the muscle that we have at the table. It does make it our town hall. In a place where the nations of the world, they can come, discuss, debate, develop solutions to common problems, and to do so bind by common commitments of international law, human rights, and of course the UN Charter. Founded after the destruction and division of the Second World War, the UN represents a bold but simple idea: the best way to prevent conflict and ensure a better future for all people who are working together as one global family. The spirit of global problem solving is now more important than ever. And we certainly know that our charter has been challenged over the last few years. Our village is beset by problems, and it's no country alone or group of people can solve them by themselves. We face a number of rising conflicts from the Middle East, Gaza, Lebanon, to Sudan, to Ukraine, Myanmar, and many other places. These conflicts have caused us massive human suffering and continue to do so, displacing millions, destroying homes and vital infrastructure, disrupting economies and draining resources that could otherwise go towards fighting poverty, hunger, and other huge challenges. 120 million people today displaced, the highest number that we've had on record. And meanwhile, we see poverty, hunger, and inequality, harsh realities faced by millions around the world. The Sustainable Development Goals, gavelled almost 8 years ago, our roadmap to address these challenges, and it was a considerable paradigm shift from where we were before, and hope to achieve a better future in 15 years by 2030. All of these at risk of failure. Less than 1/5 of the goals are currently on track, 600 million people still lacking electricity, and 2.6 billion remaining offline. Girls and women still being denied their rights, a shocking failure affecting half of humanity. We see today in one of our countries in Iraq that they are putting through legislation that would make it okay for a child to be married at 9 years old. And if that is not probably not an English word for that, but anyway, as we say, this is some of the things that we face every day, that instead of moving forward on girls' and women's rights, we are taking huge steps backwards. Divisions and mistrust are relentlessly fueled by mis and disinformation, and supercharged by technology that's rife with potential, but it also has pitfalls that have real-world consequences. And in climate change, humanity confronts nothing less than an existential planetary emergency, with the hottest year on record again, as well as droughts, floods, rising seas, melting glaciers, and other destructive impacts. Yet today we are in Baku, in Azerbaijan, a fossil fuel country, trying to get the Paris Agreement back on track. Add to this a list of destruction, the scourge of air pollution, killing 7 million people every year, land and habitat degradation, 19 to 23 million tons of plastic waste leaking into our rivers, our lakes, our seas. Nature is humanity's best friend, but through our actions and neglect, we've often treated it like our worst enemy. In fact, we have picked a fight with nature, and it is certainly fighting back. Every one of these challenges that I've mentioned today have global implications for every one of us, every one of our countries. And every country in one way or another is impacted. We learned this lesson all too well through the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID was a public health disaster in every country, but also a driver of an economic downturn from which many countries are still reeling. It was yet another reminder that borderless problems require global solutions. But the systems and structures we've built over the decades to manage the global economy, global security, global health, and global collaboration are now outdated. They're no longer fit for purpose. They represent the power structures of the post-World War II era. They don't properly reflect the rising powers and influence of so many countries and regions. They also fail to recognize realities we take for granted today: globalization, digital technology, artificial intelligence, and a multipolar world that is far less linear and more complicated than we saw during the Cold War. We cannot fight, and I think you would all agree, 21st century problems with 20th century tools. Recognizing this, in the UN, we did host the Summit of the Future in September. Against all odds and the really tense global political challenges that we faced, we did gather the countries together. Over 130 countries did come along, and we were discussing the UN at 75 and so what? And that came out of a 2-year discussion with member states in trying to understand what it was that we needed to do to respond to a world in a pact for the future. A blueprint that would show and strengthen global systems and institutions to meet today's huge challenges and make them more representative of today's world and not that of 1945. The pact is incredibly wide-ranging. And there are 4 areas that it chose to focus on. And I think here it was important to see that we were building on resolutions that we've had and not just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And today, these 4 areas that I'd like to outline for you forged in a pact that we thought was impossible. In fact, right until the last minute, we took into the General Assembly a pact that was not agreed. And standing against that pact were a couple of countries, but it was Africa that stood tall and said that this was not going to happen. In a world today when so many people needed it, this was not going to be a pact of a few words that people were wordsmithing. It was going to be about people, billions of people. This pact was supposed to, and we hope it does, reignite multilateralism, set our world on a better and more peaceful and sustainable path. The first part of this pact was actually to honor the SDGs, to say that we made a promise to people to have the SDGs by 2030, and we need to complete that. The second was peace. From the start, peace has been the raison d'etre of the United Nations. Around the world, peace and trust are in short supply. The Pact for the Future aims to strengthen the architecture for peace in important ways. For example, it includes the first multilateral agreement on nuclear disarmament in more than a decade, as well as efforts to address the weaponization of outer space and the use of lethal autonomous weapons. It includes a focus on investing in development as a means to prevent fragility, conflict, violence, and destabilization. And it includes a commitment to explore expanding the UN Security Council by addressing the underrepresentation of Africa, the Asia-Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The world's preeminent peace and security body, we all know, must reflect the world of today, not the world of 8 decades ago. The second was climate. The Pact confirms the need to keep global temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees pre-industrial levels and to transition away from fossil fuels in a just transition to energy systems to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. By next year, we're asking the world that every country must produce new plans that are economy-wide to try to achieve this. But many developing countries need support. Developed countries must keep their promises to double adaptation finance, helping developing countries to reduce emissions and accelerate the renewable energy revolution. Truth be told, is the G20 plus about 15 countries that are 87% of the emissions. So we don't need the 193 countries of the UN, just target 35, and we should get closer to it. We need to see significant contributions to the new Loss and Damage Fund to help developing economies adapt to the damage that has already been done. And in this effort, we can draw inspiration from other key planet-protecting successes, including the 2022 Global Biodiversity Framework and the international treaty underway to end plastic pollution. It is time, we hope, discuss and stop the destruction. The third was technology, and technology, all countries need and deserve to benefit from the technological breakthroughs that we've had. Artificial intelligence and quantum computing are perfect examples. At the UN, we believe that AI and quantum computing is a powerful problem-solving tool from which all governments, companies, and people could benefit. It holds enormous progress to help countries develop and get the SDGs back on track. But AI also holds enormous risks that must be managed. Similarly, we see that with quantum computing, enabling us to solve problems that are currently beyond the reach of our computers. From finance to security and healthcare, quantum computing, we know, can revolutionize industries. At the same time, all pose great risk to deepen the digital divide that is existing between developed and developing countries, and does have the direct environmental effects due to high energy consumptions. Therefore, need to establish the standards that ensure an ethical use and reduce the environmental impact. In September, what we did adopt was the Global Digital Compact. Compact outlining how governments, tech companies, academia, civil society can work together, ensuring new technologies benefit everyone while trying to manage those risks. It includes the first truly universal agreement on international governance of AI, giving every country a seat at the AI table. It is a new challenge, and we all need our hands on deck for this. In particular, we do need students and young people like yourselves to help us get an inclusive AI into the hands of innovators around the world, helping solve local problems. I'd like to encourage us all to think about this as you consider your career paths. This is the new world of technology, and for sure we're never going to be the same again. I often liken it to when we had from the horse and cart to the combustion engine. This is just that moment. But I also often think that with the UN and the challenges that we have today, we are in another League of Nations moment. We do need solutions, we need creativity, we need courage, and we know that both are in short supply. The fourth was finance. Governments needing to dramatically have higher levels of financing to invest in systems of people, from health care, education, clean water, nutrition, the basic rights that everyone in this room has. We know that investing in development is key to our stable, peaceful societies. In Rwanda and Colombia, for example, we've seen that targeted development initiatives not only revitalized economies, but they also brought divided communities together with common purpose. The sources of those investments are foundational to any economy. Taxes form the basis of social contract between governments and their citizens, and trade provides governments with critical sources of foreign currency. But in today's global economy, investments are needed, and they're just simply too great to be met. It is estimated that developing countries face a yawning gap, and we've said in the UN, from anywhere from $3 to $5 trillion a year to achieve the SDGs. And to make matters worse, many of our countries are in the grip of a debt crisis, forcing many of our countries to devote their limited resources to repaying old loans. In many cases, having to shelve their investments that they make in health and in education. We see more than half of our world's poorest countries in or at high risk of debt distress. And to illustrate this, countries spend continuously more just in the debt servicing than on critical infrastructure combined. And when they turn to the MDBs, our multilateral development banks, like the World Bank and the IMF, for assistance, they're not even getting the level of support that they need, nor are they even represented at the decision-making table. This leaves developing countries without a safety net or a voice. To fix this, the Pact for the Future called for reforming the international financial architecture. It includes commitments to closing the financing gap of the SDGs by dramatically expanding the lending capacity of multilateral development banks, and they are so small and the capitalization they need today perhaps out of reach of the political decision-making that has to be made. Reforming the sovereign debt architecture so that countries can borrow with confidence, and to expand the use of special drawing rights to assist countries during global shocks. It also called for far greater representation on our executive boards of global financial institutions. We do need and deserve a seat at the table. Next year's conference, and it's a big one, for it comes every decade, Financing for Development, and the Summit of Social Development are two milestones to carry these efforts forward. The Pact for the Future provides us with guidance for the years to come on these topics, and also includes a declaration on future generations, helping us to be mindful of the decisions we take today for those that are yet unborn. The declaration also aims to correct a historic injustice, the lack of opportunity for young people like yourselves to participate in the decisions that have affected you. It echoes the timeless call of the UN Charter to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, committing governments for the first time to taking interest in our descendants and to account in decisions we take today. Whatever path we're all choosing in the coming years, and with the life cycle from when we begin to when we end lengthening with better health, I would urge all of us to make our voices heard whenever and whichever way we can. The world we're inheriting is far from perfect, but as your school motto reminds us, nothing without great effort. By lending your ideas and hands and hearts to the task and looking far beyond the borders of communities and countries, I know that everyone here can and will make a difference. I look forward to the conversation we're going to have. This is great words that my wonderful team wrote, but I hope that you'll get more out of the question and answer that we have. Every day we are facing a world where the reality is pretty miserable today, but the ambitions of the Charter are still great. They still bring humanity together on a planet that's livable. Our job is really every day to try to close that gap. Sometimes we do well and sometimes we don't. But without that global family and that town hall, makes it very difficult for us to have visibility over those who really need that support today. And there are many questions up for grabs as we try to comprehend what is it that is happening to us in a world where, frankly, we're just wondering where the leadership has gone. We see a lot of power where there is no leadership, and a lot of leadership where is the power? And this is, I would say, we are, not for want of ticking the box, but many of the challenges that we face today are man-made. If it's climate, if it's the conflicts we have, the injustices that we see. And I will underscore the word man, because if you had women in those positions, you would not be in the position we are today. And it's not ticking a box. If you really see the peace negotiations that we have, full of men, where seed of war is born. Women want peace in the home, in the field. They carry the burden of these conflicts. And yet we do not see that you need both in the room so that we can find a pathway to peace and prosperity. And we can all live on this planet, country by country, village by village, community by community. And I think the time is now for hearing younger voices. The fire in your belly needs to be heard. It is what we need to target towards decision making, to getting out. I know today is all about new technologies, and my kids try to tell me about that, and I've got 6 of them, so I can tell you there's divergent views in my family. But it's important to protect that voice, and however we get it out, to try to shape the decisions that need to be taken today to really close that gap between the reality and the aspirations I'm sure that you all have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Your words are really important, and I want to get to many of the issues that you brought up. But I wonder, with your permission, if we could back up and talk about your own trajectory as a young person going into international diplomacy, and even earlier than that. What are some early experiences that you had that helped develop your value system?
Well, I was trouble right from the start. You ask my parents, they'll tell you. Never chose a path of diplomacy. I'm not a diplomat, I'm a development practitioner. But always looking to deliver, to see an injustice and remove those injustices, recognizing very early on that one could not do it injustice by injustice, but you really needed a system to do it. And I think, coming from a family where both my parents were in the service business, one was a nurse and the other a veterinary surgeon, so from human beings to animals, they were all around us. We got a good idea. Then there were 5 girls in northern Nigeria, which was very conservative, and no boys in our family. So, my father was there, thought not to have any leadership in his family. So we were always pushed to try to do the best that we could and be better. Of course, we still believe that we are better than the boys we didn't have, the brothers we didn't have. But I think Nigeria was really amazing for me, training ground. First of all, the strong sense of community that we had, and that, along the way, the value system that we had cared about people. I always say that I didn't as I had children or as we had many traumas that we all lived through. And in my country, we bore evidence to giving birth to Boko Haram, a terrorist organization. But faith was important. I would say that I never needed a shrink. It was my grandmother or my aunt or my uncle. Our communities were strong, and I think that always was something that you knew you could fall back on. So failure itself was a lesson. I mean, you just picked yourself up and on you went, and you always knew someone had your back. So I think early on, not to underestimate the power of family and community and faith and the things that perhaps we all take for granted, or as you have developed, you've lost. Don't lose them. They're really, really important. And then as I went on, I was lucky to be in jobs where we designed so many schools and universities, hospitals, but in the country there was never the resources to actually make them work for people. So there were these schools that were built, but either the teachers were not there, and if they were not good enough, or the classes were overcrowded, and we were suddenly thinking about, well, how do you actually deal with this? And this meant policy and government, and to begin with, my sort of angst about education system being so bad in my country, fighting for that in civil society. And I left the private sector, by the way, to go into civil society to fight government. And then they're sort of saying to you, well, you know, could you just keep your voice down and come in and help us to do this? And that was a big risk. Not many people would go into government there for fear of being absorbed, assimilated. So you try to keep one leg out or arm, hanging on to civil society for dear life, and staying in a government where it took a long time to try to get our education system at least more coherent in a federal way. And you just keep delivering. I mean, I've always said that is the more you deliver, the more needs to be done. And I think that's just keep your eyes focused on delivering for people. I think that's always mattered in our family, is that it's not okay until everybody's okay.
What a great slogan. It's not okay until everyone's okay. Tell me, you held a number of different positions within the Nigerian government, and then you went on to the United Nations, and I'm interested in that transition. What did you learn in national government that was absolutely cognizable at the international level, and what was a surprise?
Well, again, good training ground, because in managing the position I had in government, and very many different positions, a government that perhaps had weaker institutions than what I find now, but also gave me a sense of what it was to have a parliament in place that you'd have to convince. So the mirror I had from national government to the UN when I went, and the UN was never on my career path agenda. It just came by mistake. But it never was. It was about me doing the work at home and then being asked by the Secretary General, can you come and help us do this? So getting into the UN was a bit of a shock. It was, as I saw the three levels, I saw very much the Secretariat of the UN, which was very much like the cabinet or the government, the sectors. The General Assembly for me was very much about the General Assembly and Parliament. Those are the reflections that I had. But when I got into the UN, my biggest surprise was like, my goodness, this is a civil service on steroids. Because whatever I thought we had in Nigeria when we got into the UN, it was so complex. And of course, because it had been layered and built upon over the years, and that made it very difficult. So when you say the UN, what do you mean? The Secretary General, the Secretariat, the 42 funds, programs and agencies, all of which have a board that run themselves. So I think that was the biggest shock, was that the Secretary General was the Secretary and not the General. So he would say jump, you don't say how high, you move to the left and to the right, whereas my president, you say jump, you would say how high. So big differences in accountability, in navigating the power structures and the system that you needed to get to behind some of the actions that had to be taken.
I'd like to turn to the goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are, if you haven't read them, you should read them. They are expansive, ambitious, and critically important. And they're articulated in a measurable set of 169 specific targets. They run the gamut from the first Sustainable Development Goal. First is, end poverty in all forms everywhere. That's the first goal. No pressure. Yeah. And then it goes from that to one of the later goals is protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and biodiversity loss. Wow. And each one of these is incredibly ambitious, important, and has a series of very specific targets. Economic, social, financial, environmental. And the UN has been working on these goals for almost a decade. How do you measure progress? You talked in your remarks at the beginning of being disappointed, or implicitly your disappointment that there hasn't been as much progress as all of us would like. how do you think about progress and the road ahead to 2030?
I mean, first things first, these goals, sustainable development was first spoken to in 1990. It took us till 2015 to have a set of goals that represented what was the whole of development. It was a paradigm shift from just doing the social pillar to all of it. And the big question was, why not all of it? Why for some parts of the world would you consider the economy important and not in others? And how do you think you would get ever child mortality down if you didn't have a good health system? So it took us 4 years to get this set of goals, and odd set, 17, and many thought, why don't you have 8 or 6 or something that looks normal? And everybody would say, well, right now this is the response the world needs. This is really representing what people are asking for. And if they want to look at the goals and own them, this is what we need. And I think that the trouble we had in the UN was the international system had put everyone into silos in everything. Whether it was business or government or NGOs, we were all working in silos for children, for poverty, for water. To break out of those silos into a sustainable development paradigm that asked you to look at these 3 strands in a response to a challenge and finding the solutions was incredibly difficult. A, because your whole system and your mind needed to be rewired for this. You really did need to have the capacities and the skills to do that. And second, the financial system didn't work with sustainable development. Donors did not work in that way. They were used to, I want to do health and health alone and not a health system. I want a number of hospitals or sexual reproductive health products in each hospital. So it was not a holistic response to that. And that's what we've been grappling with in trying to get that done over these last few years. It has been exacerbated, not off track because we were on track. We were never on track. But it was exacerbated by COVID. Many countries could not recover their systems, their government. Some countries were printing money, others were not. And that was important. Then we had Ukraine, and the war in Ukraine just showed us how connected we were, that food systems and energy security became a big issue for everyone, miles away, where you never would think that this would have impact. And then we had, very difficult situations when the war in Gaza broke out. Then suddenly it was about different sides of the aisle, and there was a lot of polarization around that, and that did affect the way people manage the economies and the access to resources, access to many things. So there have been lots of exacerbating moments, and that set the SDGs back. Still think it can be done. Maybe not all of it by 2030, but we don't have the luxury of saying we're not going to make the best of it. Who are you going to leave behind when you say that? So you go for it and you improve all the time at getting closer to it. But it is an agenda of scale, and that's difficult to do as well. Perhaps the best that do scale, India, China, but you have to get to billions. This is not about a few thousand people. This is millions. It requires systems to be funded. It requires an international financial architecture that's just not right anymore. We need long-term concessional financing for development. And that, is extraordinary that we recognized that in 1945 when that kind of financing went to countries to rebuild themselves after the war. In fact, a couple of those countries only just finished paying a few years ago. So if that's not long-term concessional, don't know what is. We need it for today, for the rest of the world, so that it is more equal. We know the power dynamics, and everyone knows that you just don't give away power, but there needs to be a more equal world so that that power actually survives. The world that we have today is not surviving very well, and it's getting smaller in terms of those who think they're going to survive, but eventually it'll get everyone.
I'm just thinking about your work to garner the kind of agreement and support for the Sustainable Development Goals, and how you must have been so excited and proud when you got to that agreement, to that investment, and the clear articulation of these goals. And I've got to think that it's a struggle to continue to have that inspired vision every year when you measure progress, because the targets are measurable. How do you make sense of that in your own life? I mean, this is a driving force in your life. It's a driving force in the United Nations. It's critically important for humanity around the world.
I mean, I carry a sense of a lot of frustration and anger, especially where I see things could happen and they don't. But I try to channel that into getting up every day and looking for the next battle that I need to fight and to get over, and to bring as many people along in that battle to try to get it done. And it doesn't matter if it's a country. And you know, every time you go out to a country where there is a lot of suffering, the kind of experience that you bring or exposure that you bring with yourself, you find solutions really quickly. But it's to bring the partnerships together to try to get them done. And if there's any frustration, it is that it takes so little to try to get so much done, and we don't do it. If I look at the kind of resources that are spent on the war machines that we have, and the fraction of it that is needed to develop economies, and it's not that every government is sitting there, you know, just waiting for money to do the right thing. There are many governments who do have resources and don't do the right thing. But it is about finding community, finding democracy, holding and delivering to people, governance and strong institutions, partnerships, the private sector. It's a whole lot of things that need to happen, and different people that need to be brought to the table. I was lucky to go back to Nigeria after I finished the SDGs. I was sort of, you know, put into a sector that I had never had any experience in, which was environment, at a time when the Paris Agreement was being gavelled. So I did know what it was about that we were aiming for in terms of a vision. But the big shock treatment was to land in an institution where there was no idea what climate change and action should be, or that we had a triple planetary crisis of pollution and of the biodiversity. This was a ministry that over the years just dealt with sanitation. And so for all intents and purposes, I was going to be the dustbin lady. And so it was, you know, going in there and trying to turn that system around to do something took a couple of years. And going into a cabinet where my colleagues would say to me, what were you doing in the stock exchange? And I was saying, yeah, I'm just, you know, we're getting the first domestic green bond because we need this for climate change. And they were like, wow, so this is what environment's about. So even those that you thought knew about it didn't. And I think that, you know, never taking for granted that everyone knows, trying as much as possible to get away from the acronyms, to explain what it really means when you say the SDGs.
Sustainable Development Goal.
Yeah, the sustainable, no, I'm DSG and sometimes people get that mixed up, but it is important to, I always say, look at the 17 goals, take the middle out of it, the goals 7 to 15, because they're all investment spaces, investing in clean energy, in cities, and infrastructure. And if it is an inclusive economy, you will pay for the first 6 goals that you should never have to borrow for, because they're basic rights and poverty and sanitation, women's issues, healthcare, education. And all of these have to take the context of the environment, and that's why you see the environment goals. And then none of this will stand up if you don't have the institutions. Institutions are incredibly important. Today, 75 years down the road, many are losing their shelf life, and they do need a reset. That needs a lot of courage to get up and say, well, how do we do that? And it needs to feel more, not less, that you're having that transformation. And then finally, the partnerships. Ask the partnerships within your institutions, because I'm pretty sure even in this institution, across the departments, there are struggles. Sure. And from the inside out, how do you have these more genuine partnerships that, as we say in the UN, we will need many hands to lift this burden.
So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are how can the UN help facilitate, for instance, advocacy of the Global South? So most of which, you know, many countries in the Global South are the least offenders in terms of climate injustice or the contribution to climate change, and yet they need resources to help on so many of the Sustainable Development Goals. How can the UN help support the Global South to do that kind of advocacy?
I mean, the greatest tool that we have is convening. And it's about convening the different sides of the aisle to get behind what is not just, it's also profitable. I mean, this is what we say, this is not a charity case, this is investment in people, and there are returns, you know, for many things, for trade, for a better economy, for better lives. And this is the struggle that we have, is that, you know, we are the only institution that can bring strange bedfellows together, and to put people in a room to try to find these solutions. So we do this with the Global South, but we do it with business, we do it with different governments, we do this with academia. The weekend before last, I had this is the greatest part about convening. You can convene on issues that are really important, and we had a convening on mental health in humanitarian settings, and such stigma to this. But if you know the kind of mental health issues that people are suffering from long after the conflict because of the atrocities that happen in conflict, and we just don't have the hands, or do we have even the curricula for the kind of mental health that you need now. So we were discussing this together with many researchers and practitioners, and what sort of psychosocial help would we need in the field. It's that kind of convening that helps us get closer. The convening of the General Assembly that happens every year. This year, the Pact of the Future came out. What did we agree? That we needed to have an international financial architecture that would respond to the SDGs. We did have agreements around financing for development in 2015, but it's always been that the architecture is not fit for purpose. We cannot access long-term concessional funding. When you have debt, there is no debt restructuring that will allow you to have the fiscal space to spend on health, on education. So pushing all these questions with the constituencies that can take those decisions, that can change that. Bringing in civil society. We've done less well with young people, but imagine 75 years later, we actually have an office for youth. And the person that is there is a young person. I mean, people wonder why I'm saying that, but in my country, when we had my political party, the youth leader for us was like 65 years old. So never take it for granted that, that young at heart piece. But we have a young man who is leading our youth office right now, and he's opened up a lot of space, not just for young people, but from the way that we approach a discussion with young people and bring them to the table. It's okay to have a position at the table, but do we even allow you the voice? And if you've got the voice, what happens after that? So it's about not ticking the box, but having you all the way through it. So I think that the convening around the issues which are predominantly in the Global South are a continuous effort, and you have to innovate, you have to be more creative, you have to bring new people in all the time. Now we're using technology more. It's I think gets to a wider audience than we've ever had at all. What comes back, of course, is not always what you want to hear, but it's also I think it's also a big wake-up call to the diversity of this world, the needs, the expectations. The way you're perceived. I mean, that's another thing, is not to stay in this little bubble of the UN thinking that we are just do-gooders. And to hear from the outside. Often when the UN is criticized, the first thing you will hear is a defense. You go into knee-jerk, let me defend. You don't have to defend, you just have to listen. You might actually learn something and do it differently. And I think that's another aspect of bringing technology in and bringing young people in, is that we're beginning to see that we have to look in the mirror sometimes too.
So you've had a front row seat for some time about the impact of climate change. Can you tell us a positive and hopeful story? I'm just thinking we need it right now. About how something was solved, something got better, something specific.
Wow, okay. What got better? Well, we never thought we'd get a loss and damage fund in Cairo. First, the focus on Cairo and Egypt was human rights, wasn't even climate, because there were so many challenges there. And then came along recognizing that the damage that had been done and continues to be done to our small island states. And this loss and damage fund had been something long asked for. It happened really quickly. It in fact was the fastest that we'd ever stood up a fund. and now doesn't have the resources that we need to respond, but at least it was a good beginning to see that people still believe that we needed a mechanism to respond to the challenges of small island states. There was another one when we finally got the government to put aside resources in my country to deal with the environment in cleaning up the oil spills from the oil companies that provided, now livelihoods to men and women and communities. And that was really difficult. When I first went to the Niger Delta, water, the soil, everything smelled of petroleum. Wow. And to clean up, you literally have to wash the sand. And you can imagine tons and tons of that. But to start that process, to clean up the creeks, to give people a future that perhaps they never thought that they would have, just from that small space, which we knew had to go much further. But starting that was incredible, and to see how that's benefited many women and communities was also another good story. I don't think we should walk away from the Paris Agreement. That was also another incredible feat. We were all there, and the pushback against many of those issues, of course, we're not living up to the commitments that we made, but to have that there, that's something you can fight for. That's a good thing, and I think that, the SDGs and the Paris Agreement are good tools that we should put to use.
I'm wondering how you think about putting them to use, just to pursue this. There are lots of different ways. There's encouraging states, there's sort of shaming states to live up to the commitments that they've made. And the convening, the sort of celebration of we are all on the same page, that's part of it, I gather.
It depends who you're talking to. I mean, we thought we'd think about your grandchild, because that's the future that matters, and you think that will tug at some heartstrings. And I said that to a businessman in one of our convenings, and he said to me, I really have to tell you the truth, I've got a trust fund for my grandchild, so that's not going to pull my strings. It's a big wake-up call for me, because not everyone responds to that. So what is he going to respond to? And I said, well, so okay, your grandchild's okay, mine isn't. How are we going to deal with this? And he said, well, you bring me a deal, and it's the deal that I want. It's not the money. I just want to make that deal work. It's the way they're wired. And I think that what it taught me is to meet people where they're at and try bring them to where you need to bring them. And many of these businessmen did come to our side, because we started to say to them, okay, so what makes up that transition for you in your company going green? What are the issues that you would need to attend to, and how could that affect the jobs and the investments that you make in our countries? You begin to have a conversation, and then you can get closer to it. But it is not easy. I mean, every conversation that you have will be different, and the world is so very different. What you need in Africa is different from the SIDS, the small island developing states. It's different from places in Asia, and you really do have to get a picture of that. Data is a big problem for us. We don't have, the aggregates, the figure of 17% towards the SDGs is an aggregate sum. The disaggregate, we don't know. All these years later, not able to have baseline data is a big problem for many communities. So when we say leave no one behind, we don't actually know where the no ones are. And you're trying to figure out, which of these communities, indigenous people with disabilities, LGBTQI, where are they all? And you have to try to still figure that out with what we're doing. But there are, for instance, now we try to clarify a little bit better at the country level and with donors, that if we focus on 6 areas of investment, the first 3 are interconnected, so it helps us to deal with a SDG agenda that is about the 3 strands of sustainable development. And that is to do food systems. Everybody understands food systems from production to the table. It's a huge ecosystem. But with developing countries, unless you can power it, and that means off-grid, because the local communities are not on grid, don't have power. So again, this gives you an opportunity for green solutions and green energy. So power the food systems and then connect them to markets, women having their financial services online for the first time. They can protect their resources. Extension work, you don't have to come to a university. You will have the apps that will help you in the field. Suddenly you've got produce. Okay, how do I get to market? Online. Suddenly you're marketing these goods, and seeing this happen in communities that would never have had access before. So we say these are three important investment opportunities. Big business likes that, it's scale, it's profitable. Then the other three areas are softer issues. The first, saying that the environment is one in which climate is a big issue. The second is education. Education will be different going forward, but how do we at least deal with the skills that you need to connect to market, so that you're going into school, coming out with a skill set that can get you a job, you can create a job, that you are able to pursue your path. And then last but not least, for those that are falling through the cracks, that social protection floor is really important. So to rethink financial instruments like insurance, which forever and a day has been health, but why can it not be education? And people say, well, how do you do that? Well, you did health, you can do this. It really requires us to just become a little bit more genius about how to find those solutions. So that set of 6 investments is one that we push for people to become more engaged and connected with the possibilities of an investment and what it means for people, for jobs, for changing the economies. But we also know that in many of our countries, we don't have a number of skill sets that we need, even in this economy. We are short of those that will help us with policy and regulatory environment. This is expensive, it takes time, it's complex. We're short of people who know how to design for scale. We're very happy at doing the small projects of schools, of small health clinics. That's not going to help you get to scale. I've got 240 million people in Nigeria. A project for 1 million is not going to make the difference. So designing for scale that would attract the investors to come in. And then the other two are, looking at the financial mix that you need. Yes, you need domestic resources. They will always be the resources that are sustainable. But you need to attract foreign direct investment and others to come into it. And I'll go full circle around to goal 16, strong institutions. You cannot deliver on services, you cannot deliver and sustain some of these investments without having the capacity in your governments, in local governments and communities, civil society.
Speaking of governments, I'm sure you're aware that the United States had a national election recently. And I know you don't want to comment on the outcome of that election, but I wonder if you have thoughts or hopes about how the U.S. can engage in global diplomacy moving forward.
Well, the U.S. are the largest shareholder, contributor, host to the United Nations. That for them should be their oyster and their gateway to diplomacy and the world, because that's where it all comes. No matter what the US does, it will not convene 193 countries, maybe 50, 60 at best. And we do in the UN, and this is in your backyard. So use it. I think that's really important. Don't give up on it. If there are things that it's doing that you don't, we all feel that we could make it better. And I think that's what we need to do, is to engage with that. The election that happened in this country, I think was a big wake-up call. This was not a small number of people that voted for President Trump, and it went through everything from your popular vote to your Senate to your governors to your House. It was everything. Just look at the map. And for us, looking at it from the international community and perhaps even my country, would be to ask the question: okay, so what next? Why did this happen? Whose perceptions were they of a country that was, are you divided, or in fact closer together than you ever imagined? And leadership, what does that mean? And we have these perceptions of leadership that should fit this box. And when it doesn't, it's really difficult for us to deal with, and we put it into another box. So it's either good or it's not good. And then you perhaps don't find the places that you can engage with. And I'll say this because in Africa, for many, many decades, everybody told us we had bad leadership. Leadership didn't do this, and it didn't do that, and didn't do the other. So now in the world, there's no monopoly on bad leadership, right? It is just leadership that, as I said earlier, we need to understand better how to make it function for the people. Does it deliver? And there are many different ways of delivering, but we have democracy. We have a model that we all follow and that we have fed to the world. I think the values of democracy are sacrosanct, and I think we should hold on to them and protect them. But perhaps we ought to start questioning the model. Does it work for everyone? Does it deliver for people? It can't always be that, well, we don't practice it, it doesn't function because we don't do what we're supposed to do. In many cases, you do. And I think that for me, I find a struggle. I can talk about my country because I don't talk about another country, but I talk about mine. I mean, democracy for us is very expensive. It's expensive because the parliament and government is there and really high salaries, and it is expensive. It's also short term. Whichever country in 4 years, even the World Bank doesn't get through a project in 4 years. So when you're thinking about building from nothing to developing a country, having sometimes long-term trajectories would help. So it's expensive, it's short-term, and unfortunately the governance, the way and manner in which we have these election cycles with no systems in place for the day after you fall out of office, therefore gives you huge governance challenges in the models that we have for democracy in developing countries.
I thought that we would just have a moment for a couple student questions, and a number of them were submitted in advance. Michael is a Brooklyn College student and says, as a proud Brooklyn College graduate student and former UN Secretariat staffer, welcome to our campus. What do you consider the future of the role of citizen and public diplomacy in our colleges and universities in light of Sustainable Development Goals 16 and 17?
That's a UN question. I think that, the discourse between what we see in citadels of learning and what we see in real life in the practice of diplomacy is very different. And I think there needs to be a better interaction between the two. I'm having a conversation like this with you, but when I left Nigeria, I came to teach at Columbia. And when they asked me to design this course, what I did was from policy to practice, because I felt like the practice of what it is that we do and intend to achieve stayed very firmly in the domain of what we were learning and continuing to learn. And when you go into the UN, you find that the disconnect is that so much process, so much about what the learning was, and reinforcing it with you in academia, and not getting out into pushing it out the door to implement it.
So theory versus practice. Get to practice, yeah.
A huge problem. And I think that, one needs to see that feedback loop from more interaction with practitioners at the local level. I mean, I went into the UN feeling all the time like I had to have the answer. And I was thinking, this is not a class. This is real life. And some of those answers are not there. They're what we're supposed to co-create here, and with people in the field, and come back and, listen a little more. I mean, if I hear anything from my country teams when I go to the field, it's, could you just do a little less process and understand that we're here dealing with what we would say in New York, can you please figure out the nexus between humanitarian development and climate? And they're looking at you like, what are you talking about? This thing just happens, and this is how it is on the ground. It doesn't fit in. It does not fit into that. You can say, have the practice and bring it back into how you explain it, and then back again. So I think there's a big disconnect between what it is that we say we are trying to achieve and what we do.
So this is a question that circles back to where you began your talk. It's from Sabera Chowdhury from the class of 23. Considering that only 17% of the Sustainable Development Goals are on track, with just 6 years left until the 2030 deadline, how should businesses prioritize their efforts? It's interesting that the question is about businesses. I'm also just thinking, how do we collectively, in the public sector, in the private sector, how should we address this issue?
Well, I think we're all a part of it. I mean, whether you find yourself in business or you find yourself in government or otherwise, it is to look at that business and to see how sustainable it is. I mean, we talk about the circular economy, but we also talk about greening your business. We have got big asks of industry right now, from cement to steel to the shipping industry. These are all businesses that need to rethink their business model with what it will take to use less fossil fuel than they are today. That has challenges. I mean, in the short term, there will be a cost, but in the longer term, you'll be on the right side of history. You need to, I think, find incentives for that. You need to have a narrative that doesn't say, well, because this cement industry goes green today, that will create jobs or you will lose jobs. It's the whole ecosystem of what that cement industry plugs and plays, and that will give us far more. So, yeah, I think that we are speaking to we're speaking to many industries, many businesses. The food industry, as I said, it is very different. I mean, map out what it is and what is moving in your space of the world, and how do you want that to transition. The market has a great deal to play with this as well. We're talking about sustainability, and I think it's very difficult for us to look at people who can't see tomorrow's meal and try to engage them in a conversation of sustainability again.
And when you think about your legacy, what do you hope your legacy is?
Wow. I think that, you know, for me, coming to the UN was to try to make sure that I left it better than I met it. Yeah. I can say today, if I left this today, we have. Half of the management in the United Nations are women. They were not before. Half of those resident coordinators that sit in 130 countries engaging with government and communities to get the work done, half of that leadership is also women. I think that we have put on the agenda many issues that were not there when we came, like mental health. We've not solved the problem of Haiti, but that was one country that we put up front and thought this is ridiculous that in, you know, the 2000, then it was of course 2017, that this is still a problem, but look at us, 2024, it is still a big issue. I think we've given far more visibility to many areas that we would not have otherwise had done in climate, to show, you know, what you can do to try to get to that. We've created many convenings to do better at what we do. So not enough, and I will leave the place, you know, feeling that I've got so much undone, but I think I will feel satisfied that given this privilege in this time, that I did leave it better than I met it, and that I've got so much more to do in my own country. And that's really where I'm looking forward to getting back to.
I so thank you for this conversation, Deputy Secretary General. I want you all to join me in thanking Deputy Secretary General.
Thank you.